Long ago, back in 1995, when I was a student like many of you, the great Professor Joel Cohen asked the question, how many people can the Earth support? That question haunted me for years. It always struck me as the most important question we should be asking ourselves as humanity increasingly warmed our planet and crushed its ecosystems hectare by hectare by hectare. 5 years ago, or a quarter century later, I finally got around to writing this book as my response to Professor Cohen's question. And just so I don't keep you guessing where I fall on the issue, I put my answer on the cover. But back then, far too many of my friends didn't even know how many people were on the planet. I hadn't realized just how distant a topic it could be for so many folks. Most people I queried were off by hundreds of millions, if not billions. They didn't know how many additional people we added to the planet each year, and they also didn't know the differing fertility rates around the world or globally. They didn't know that the global fertility rate actually masked two very different stories, where half of the nations on our planet had already reached a fertility rate of 2.1 or below, and the other countries on our planet were still struggling and growing, sometimes at more than half every 20 years. My friends also were unaware of the massive demographic transition that occurred over the last century or so, going from 5 children per woman on average in 1950 to below 2.5 children per woman today. This demographic transition brought health and wealth to those nations that navigated the path. But for those nations that were left behind, too often it's insecurity, economic turmoil, violence, and suffering that they experience. In the end, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised at how many of my friends were unfamiliar with all of this. After all, what class even teaches this stuff? Still, they were aware, often, of the controversies. Wasn't Malthus wrong, they might say, reducing the entire discussion somehow to whether or not we could feed a growing humanity? Or, are there really limits to growth? Or, are there really limits to growth, as though somehow we never run into the limits of a finite planet? Or, doesn't human ingenuity somehow guarantee superabundance? Harkening back to quoting a Cato Institute celebration of the economist Julian Simon. Still others recall the dark history of eugenics, forced sterilization, and the kinds of racist, classist, ableist, misogynistic paternalism that's all too easy to find in the history of 20th century social interventions, echoes of which can still be heard today. But their familiarity with these issues often didn't leave them able to grapple with the issues underpinning Professor Cohen's question, how many people can the Earth support? Instead, too often, it led to various kinds of population denialism. Humanity long ago outstripped the ecological carrying capacity of our planet, and we are now in an advanced state of ecological overshoot. The Global Footprint Network presently calculates that it requires 1.75 Earths to support humanity in our current levels of population and consumption. My estimate is that we're actually quite a bit worse off than that, having accumulated enormous mountains of ecological debt that must be paid down before the Earth, like a loan shark, demands payment and then either breaks your knees or kills us. The very ecosystems that supported the rise of humanity as we know it are being systematically deleted and burdened by an ever-growing human footprint of almost unimaginable proportions. We often forget that our planet is simply a collection of ecoregions, each made up of unique constellations of flora and fauna, singular flows of water, distinct terrain, and region-specific climates. Not only on land, but also at sea, because as it turns out, our planet's surface is covered by 70% by oceans. When you look at the human footprint, that has so damaged every one of our historic ecosystems, the historic ecosystems that have supported humanity, in which humanity depends, you begin to think a little bit differently. Particularly when you realize that every year we have less and fewer ecosystem goods and services to support our species, but we demand more and more each year for our ever-growing population as we add more than 80 million people to our planet. This fall, humanity reached 8 billion in size, making all of our planetary crises just that much harder to manage. You see, growing population is a threat multiplier. After all, when your boat is sinking and a storm is coming in, do you want to actually keep putting more people in it? Officially, the UN celebrated this as, quote, a milestone for development and for incredible improvement in public health and longevity. This statement most certainly is true, but what it omits is inexcusable. For just below the surface, in private, there is a stark recognition that runaway population growth and the consumption that comes with it are driving the global problems, imperiling us all. As we add an additional 80 million people to our planet, the equivalent of 10 New York cities, or an additional Germany each year, we have seen the steady growth, the steady march of climate change, ecological destruction, and human misery. But when the TV cameras are back on again, those who celebrate 8 billion are quick and nervous to point out that it'll all be okay somehow, because after all, humanity's population is growing at the slowest rate ever, only 1% a year, down by more than half since the middle of the 20th century. Well, if 8 billion is to be celebrated and everything's going to be okay at 9 billion or 10 billion, why wouldn't we just want this to go on forever? Why do they even make these points? Well, the reason is that they're secretly trying to secretly put a shiny, happy smile on the situation. They're haunted by one question: how many people can the Earth support? Just before the United Nations established the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, the UN working groups asked this question and examined it. After all, how can the SDGs be sustainable without a sustainable population? How many people can the Earth support? This was not a new question. Scientists and policymakers had been asking it for decades. It was a major topic on the first Earth Day back in 1970. There was even a presidential commission formed by President Nixon in 1970, where many credible voices foresaw another doubling of the global population coming and were clear that it was unsustainable. But by the time the SDGs were adopted in 2015, it seemed that 9 billion was actually already baked into the system, perhaps even 10 billion. So the SDGs conveniently ignored population altogether. They also ignored our commitment to the next generation of children under the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child, where the global community committed decades ago to providing children a fair start in life, not a future of ever-dwindling ecological resources. The UN's silence on these issues has been deafening, as the global community has continuously missed its SDG targets year after year after year. But when you look back at that demographic transition where half of our world has already experienced, but yet which we have denied the other half of the world access to, you realize that we're actually just this close to flipping fertility from an 1% annual increase to a 1% annual decrease. When you reflect on the fact that in every geography where women are empowered, educated, integrated into the workforce, and given access to family planning technologies, fertility is actually stable or below replacement value. And as you realize that human population is already projected to peak, perhaps at 10.4 billion in 2080, as projected by the United Nations, perhaps at 9.7 billion in 2064, as projected by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, you kind of realize that this is already inevitable, and you embrace that inevitability of the global demographic transition. So if it's already inevitable, why wouldn't we want to hasten this demographic transition by simply investing more in women and girls around the world? It is, after all, a good in and of itself, investing in women and girls. Yet, we're still so woefully behind. Maybe, just maybe, we could listen to Malala, who said, when we educate girls and when we empower them and give them quality education that they need, it actually helps us tackle climate change, because when girls are educated, they have fewer children. Malala's point isn't just related to our climate emergency, it actually relates to the larger ecological crisis that is engulfing our planet, driving human insecurity around the world. Maybe we could just clone Malala a couple hundred times so she can help navigate all of our nations through this revolutionary opportunity. What if the US invested the same amount of money that we invest to sustain a single major weapon system, like the Joint Strike Fighter, which receives $12.5 billion a year in funding? Invest $12.5 billion a year in women and girls around the world? What would that do to hasten the inevitable demographic transition into a more inclusive demographic transition and begin releasing the ever-growing pressure that we have been putting on our planet over the past couple centuries? What if, as my colleague Nanda de Bajaj says, what if we could invest these funds to end the countless forms of coercive pronatalism that compel women and girls to have children that they have no interest in having? Did you know that nearly half of all pregnancies on planet Earth each year are unintended? I ask you, as the next generation of leaders, couldn't we supercharge this inevitable demographic transition by enabling girls to delay childbirth until at least adulthood? Could we enable girls to prioritize education and control their own reproductive destiny by enabling true reproductive autonomy? Could we empower boys and men to participate in shared reproductive responsibility? Could we invest in ways that help communities around the world to build the health, care, and education infrastructure required to hasten this transition? I have no doubt that the minds in this room will provide answers to these questions. What if this investment could complete that long journey of demographic transition from 5 children per woman in 1950 to 2.3 today, to bring the global fertility rate down below replacement value, down to, say, 1.5 by 2030? Already women, on average, globally, are having fewer than 2 to 3 children at 2.3. 1.5 would simply mean that as a global average, women would have 1 to 2 children instead of 2 to 3 children. Might I suggest that if coercive pronatalism were cast in the dustbin of history once and for all women and girls around the world, achieving a global fertility rate of 1.5 would be easily achievable? Well, I wanted to do some math on this, and I wanted to see what the art of the possible might be. The curve would look something like this, as compared to the latest UN projections that are driven by that deafening silence that I talked about earlier. Following this scenario, we could actually reach 3 billion soon after 2120, say a century from now. Rather than an unsustainable 1% population increase, causing irreparable harm to the planet and incalculable human suffering, why not? Why shouldn't we enjoy a 1% annual population decrease, creating more and more room for our planet to heal each year, while moving all of humanity up the development curve, providing them access to increased well-being and prosperity? As it turns out, this approach aligns with the 2019 World Scientists' warning of a climate emergency, which had nearly 15,000 co-signatories from 158 countries. Their words made me feel like I was in good company. As the next generation of leaders, it is in your power to make this revolution a reality. Your leadership can help hasten this demographic transition as a more inclusive demographic transition, empowering countless women and girls around the world and the communities that they contribute to. That would help remove unsustainable population growth as a threat multiplier and make it much easier for a smaller humanity to transition away from a carbon economy as those of us in the developed world learn to consume far less. Your leadership could bend all of these curves simultaneously and flip the doomsday script, making the back half of the 21st century your own vision for the future. Whether you want to be a politician, economist, or a jurist, a scientist, a business person, a teacher, a health professional, an engineer, or a geographer, an innovator, a thinker, or a practitioner, the world urgently needs you to find the role that you can play in this revolution, hastening the inevitable demographic transition. It is you, your ideas, your gifts, and your grit that will shape our future. So I say to you, don't just join the revolution, lead it. Thank you.